Mr. Jonathan Dimbleby is an award-winning broadcaster and journalist with the BBC. He's also an esteemed World War II historian, and he has a new book coming up soon. He's served on the front lines. He's reported from Hong Kong. He wrote the Last Governor, the series on Chris Patton's final years here, and I think more recently he has taken up the chairing of World Questions, which complements Any Questions that runs in the UK. And World Questions is the reason he's in Hong Kong this week. They did a special on Hong Kong, which is running this weekend on the BBC World Service on Saturday. I think that's right, Jonathan. Yeah. So, by all accounts, he's as esteemed as they get. So the way today will run is I will open up with some questions, and then we will throw it open to yourselves, the members, given the opportunity we have with Mr. Dimbleby. Great. Well, Jonathan, I should say, obviously, given your experience, you've seen it all in your decades. You now host World Questions. You've seen different political cycles. You've seen events come and go, leaders come and go. Right now, there's quite a fragile sentiment out there with Trump, Brexit, North Korea, and the rest. How would you assess the state of world affairs today compared to previous cycles you've seen? Is the gloom merited, or are the risks being exaggerated?
And I just want to say, first of all, for me, who have been here occasionally in the past, usually as a journalist rather uncomfortably, because I was spending a long time here between 92 and 97 on the basis that everything I discovered I could publish in 1997, but I couldn't mention or talk about anything I discovered until then. And there were a number of journalists here, and had I been among them, I would have been equally frustrated by the fact that I did know what they didn't know and kept it to myself. No journalist likes that. But it's an honour to be here. This is a very important place to be. It's a very important place in China. It's a very important place in Asia. And it has reached far beyond its membership. So I'm honoured to be invited here. So to answer your question, I go back to when I was a young journalist in the early 70s. We lived under the shadow of the nuclear umbrella, the uncertainties of what could happen if things went wrong. There was the deployment of land-based missiles in Europe, which caused a great anxiety in case that would trigger a conflict between the Warsaw Pact countries and NATO, which could escalate. And then we reached the end of the Cold War, the liberation of Eastern Europe, and most of us felt it was a highlight in the life of our nations and of the world. I spent a lot of time in that period in Africa and Asia, and to a degree in Latin America, and it's easy to forget. The entire existence of most of those countries was dependent upon the allegiances they formed or tried to resist forming with the two big superpowers, who in proxy ways conducted their conflict through those states. Most of Africa was still extremely autocratic. There was not even the appearance of democracy. Latin America was still run mainly by self-garlanded generals. And the ability of the foreign media to report was highly constricted. You didn't have mobile phones. You didn't have any means of making communication except by booking a long phone call well in advance, and then because you were out, you missed your slot and had to start all over. So that was the world. By comparison with where we are now, it seems extraordinarily stable. I woke up, like many people, after my country voted Brexit, in a state of shock and astonishment. Those who supported Brexit were equally astonished because they never expected to win. Like many people, I never believed that Donald Trump would emerge as President of the United States, and I thought it would be catastrophic if he did, and that most people in the United States would recognize that to be the case. More latterly, in my own country, I did not imagine the Prime Minister, who was a vicar's daughter, who had said that there were no circumstances in which she would call a snap election, decided to do so. So Britain is at the moment Conservatives are in office, but they're hardly in power, and the rest of the world is on tenterhooks. I think we're in very uncertain times. I think we are in quite alarming times because of the unpredictability of the American president. The one thing about the leaders of Russia and China is that they may behave in unpredictable ways, but they have, we are quite clear about what their broad intentions are in the West, and that is hugely unsettling. It's unsettling for all people, and I think in a way that I've never imagined. And if you're a journalist, you have to be glass half full. And I'm generally a glass half full. I've never felt closer to being glass half empty than I am at this moment. And I hope we can come through this very distressing and alarming patch in the global life.
Well, let me follow up on that point because it seems quite striking, given your language about how unsettling it is. Yesterday, of course, we had North Korea launching an intercontinental ballistic missile. You are a World War II historian. Without being shrill about it, how far along the trajectory are we to a potential possible conflict, or is that still really something that's not on the radar?
Well, the World War II was driven by Hitler's mad zealotry for conquest in Europe. It was triggered, as it happens, rather as the First World War, it was triggered. The decision to go ahead and invade Russia in 1941 was made as a result of what was happening in the Balkans. The Balkans were the tinder. We know the Balkans remain something of a tinder because of Crimea and then obviously into Europe in Ukraine. In the case of North Korea, you have absolute uncertainty about what capacity they have, what intentions they have, what they're seeking to do. Do they genuinely feel threatened by the outside world? You look to China and wonder why China can't take a greater action. You know that the conditions under which the United States would use massive last resort power against North Korea because it felt that North Korea did indeed, as not only had an intercontinental ballistic missile that could reach its target, but could reach its target with nuclear warheads. We don't know, but if there was a retaliation, or you could stop those weapons because you have the defensive resources to do so, but decided to punish, or if you decided on a first strike to preempt, you know that the people who would be most probably worst affected would be the population of the south of Korea. So do you eliminate the population of the south in order to protect yourself from the depredations of the north? These are hugely difficult issues. My guess, and it's no more than a guess because of the nature of the presidency in the White House, is that he will be held back if he is so minded. You never know because he's so mercurial what his mind is. He will be held back from that kind of step. And you have to believe that if you give up believing these kind of things, then you sort of give up on life. You have to believe that however deranged he may or may not be, that the North Koreans will not invite upon themselves the destruction in one form or another that would follow from them using weapons of mass destruction. So, but of course, I think what happens as a result of all these things, I mean, it's the same with Brexit, it's the same relations, Russian-American relations. You are constantly diverted by tensions. Now, that's been the story of humanity, but these diversions are at the moment destructive of developing all sorts of projects which ought to be for the good of all.
What about on the optimistic side, given the part of the world?
Shall we try that?
As a counterweight, I mean, the European elections have gone in ways that wasn't obvious at the start of the year. Holland, France, Germany's on track, Austria, etc. Arguably, the UK election was for a softer Brexit. I won't go down that rabbit hole. But is it the case then that despite the wider turmoil, Europe is coming closer together and could possibly be a beacon of stability in all of this?
I have always felt that the European Union historically was important because it was a force for stability in Europe. And people without memories forget how the capacity of Europe to disintegrate, to destroy itself, and it's been a beacon of stability. I was actually in Paris on the evening of Macron's election, and that confirmed the belief that I have had that the integrity of Europe is not only very important, but is greater than we feared. And it's true, the populist movements in Europe, Le Pen in France, in Poland and Hungary, you have two extremely disagreeable governments. Greece, that suffers most from the consequences of being inside the euro, there's a tiny minority who want to leave the euro. You look elsewhere, most of the European countries believe that it's better to be in than out. If the European Union was to collapse, as some seem to believe would be in the interests of the nation states, and that was part, of course, of our Brexit debate, I think the results of that would be a far more uncertain world. And I am optimistic about Europe. The centre ground is holding. Remember that poem by Yeats, "The centre cannot hold," as he looked at the Irish, at the Irish problems in 1915, and the centre ground is holding in Europe, and it will. It is complicated, of course, by the fact that Britain is consuming its entire intellectual, civil service, governmental capacity in negotiating an exit.
Well, let me ask my final question then. If Europe is holding together, is it enough to offset what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the level of uncertainty that we're seeing in the US government?
It's intriguing, isn't it, to see how independent the voices of Europe are sounding from their extreme uncertainty and dismay about the Bush administration. Angela Merkel sounding very independent indeed. France has always expressed itself independently. Britain historically has always been very reluctant to sever what it likes to regard, I think wrongly, as a special relationship. And we have been the voice of the United States. Britain is now, at the moment, a much less potent voice in these debates. We're sidelined in Europe, we don't matter, and whatever Donald Trump's relationship may be and admiration for the United Kingdom, his political focus of the White House, of Foggy Bottom, the Foreign Office, the Foreign Department's focus is, it's not actually on Britain. I was reading this morning a piece in the New York Times about the people shaking their heads. How is it that ordinary Republican working class individuals continue to give Donald Trump their support when he is making decisions that directly and immediately have an adverse impact on their own economic interests? And this is being traced back into the 19th century and 18th century. And it was quite interesting. If I were an American, I have to say I would belong, I'm quite sure, inevitably, like nearly everyone here, probably to that sort of liberal elite that occupies the East Coast and doesn't take much interest in the rest. However, I was there actually for this program, as I was in France for this program we were doing last night in America, and in the United States, in Washington, and there's some very good stuff being written about Trump's background and history, which, if you felt disconcerted, would, I'm afraid, only confirm the degree to which you were underestimating the challenge of Donald Trump, and it's fact-checked, and it's objective, and it's accurate. There are psychologists in America who, on the basis of the evidence that they can see from outside, say that he ticks the boxes for being clinically of unsound mind. And I put it as neutrally as it's possible to put it. And under those circumstances, people ask them, well, why don't you say so? And of course, in the medical profession, certainly in the United Kingdom and in America, sometimes the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath means that until you've actually seen the patient personally, you do not diagnose on the basis of external evidence. However, so concerned are such people that it is on the table, at least, that this will go public. Now, whether that means that the Republicans in Congress, who are obviously as uncomfortable as it's possible to be about the man who says, I'm not a Republican, and he's in the White House, will do anything about that in due course when they've got a big majority. It is very uncertain. It goes back to where you asked at the beginning. I mean, we don't know where we are, and anyone who thinks they do should be ignored. Okay. So this is your opportunity to ask Mr. Dimbleby some questions. If you have any, just please state your name and keep your questions reasonably short, please, so we can pack in as many as possible. Thank you. Yes, this lady.
I'm Julia Charlton. I'm a solicitor in Hong Kong. I think I'm in the category of people you think should be ignored, and I'm very interested in your well, actually, lack of self-reflection on why you were so astonished that the Brexit vote passed, why you've expressed such amazement that Donald Trump is in power. I would like to hear your reflections on what and why it's...
Sorry, I missed that last part.
That changed, because clearly things have changed. And to look at things, I think, what would your reflections be on being more realistic about the change that actually has happened instead of being astonished about it?
I think when I say I'm astonished about it, I was astonished at the outcomes. I took the prevailing view that people would, in the UK would vote for Remain and they'd vote against Trump. And if I were interviewing you, I would say, how were you so certain that the Brexit vote would triumph and that Donald Trump would emerge triumphant? And you're right. Of course, at one level, you're right, we misread. Most people misread, and they probably misread because they wanted not to know. And if you wanted me to do a tiny bit of analysis, I'll take the Brexit case. We in inverted commas, hugely underestimated the degree of alienation, resentment, feeling of economic, being ignored economically, the divisions between those who had and those who had not. Which had grown sharply, although everyone's incomes have risen over the period, despite they're back to better than 2008 levels. Combined with that in Britain, I think I certainly underestimated the degree to which my own generation looked so askance at a Europe which had been described to them correctly in many ways as being bound by red tape, arthritic, and so forth, and without seeing any historical perspective or being interested in any historical perspective. So I was surprised and I was shocked, but I think a large number of people, I haven't touched on this hitherto, also thought that the country was being overrun by immigrants. Although it is the case that the immigration that was controllable, 50% of it approximately came from outside the European Union, and that could have been halted. And it wasn't halted for very good economic and reasons, because we had a growing economy. Inside the European Union, it is true, there was freedom of movement. But I think my own view is that people read into their own problems in the UK, their social economic problems I just touched on, that the responsibility for that lay with people coming from outside, accepting cheap labour jobs and crowding them out of their hospitals and their schools. That was strongly felt. Even by those same people, which is why I was surprised, who knew that their hospitals were principally staffed, to a very significant degree staffed by European migrants, doctors, nurses, porters, that the work that they did not want to do very often was being done by young men coming to Europe, sending money home to their families so that they could build houses there or to look after aged parents in Romania and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. I misread that. But I think that was there. And I also think the last thing I'd say is that there were a large number of people of my generation who have done very well out of life and who are living in a relatively comfortable retirement in the southeast and southwest, which is where I live. And I think they had a view that somehow you could take back power, as if power is something that is yours to have or not to have, rather than the way in which I do see it, which is power is something that's based on influence, on capacity to share authority for the benefit of yourself and for others, and that there is the world of sort of absolute power, particularly if you're a small nation that is declining globally, although a very powerful nation still, is that power. You won't agree with me, I know, but that's my view.
Yeah, I'm Florence de Changy. I report for Le Monde and the French National Radio. I'd love to bring you into Hong Kong now, that you know so well.
I'm very happy to be in Hong Kong.
in your speech as well. So 2 questions I'm interested in. One is your view on Hong Kong youth. I wonder if you saw that coming 20 years ago, that being the Hong Kong youth that we have. And the other comment I'd be very keen to hear you about is the Hong Kong-UK relationship, the latest Boris Johnson comments, Chris Patten saying that he has regrets, and then the way China has replied to this. Thank you.
On the first one, I was not surprised, and actually was delighted in this way. On our programme last night, we had Joshua Wong, who you may think that he's made some errors of one kind or another, but he is a remarkable illustration of the intelligent young of this generation. Go back 20 years, in fact, go back to my case to 1992 and even before, when his parents' generation were not invited by Britain to participate democratically, were being run in a paternal way, and when Chris Patten came in, he caused a lot of ructions. He had very little room for manoeuvre to widen the democratic base here because of the agreement that had been made, which ended up in the basic law following the joint declaration between the United Kingdom and the government of China. And what he did do, as I think a lot of people here will know, whether they agree with what he did or whether they didn't, and unhappily it seems to me a large proportion of the business community, for their own sake, didn't look over the end of their nose and were very inclined to attack him and criticise him and in my view, inappropriately, for trying to increase people's right to express themselves freely and to have the confidence to do so. He did that with Joshua Wong's generation's parents. And actually I asked at supper last night, just over there, I asked Joshua about the impact on him of his parents' generation. And those were the young then, right, when I was here first of all. And they were fantastic people. I think Hong Kong people are extraordinary in any case. Whether I agree with what their stance are, there's a vitality in Hong Kong. You know, there's a vigour, it's wonderful. They inherited from their parents the belief that they had rights to express themselves, to seek to ensure that the basic law is interpreted in ways that enhance democracy, that do lead towards one person, one vote. It seems to me, a humiliation if for people who've been brought up in the culture which those individuals have, to be denied a future in which their voice is heard in that way. That's the first thing. The second, relations between UK and China. In the way that one does as a writer or a journalist, when I was here for quite a long time, I came across minutes of meetings that were conducted in the late 80s between the British government and the Beijing government. In public, if you look back, and some of you will recall, the British government was saying to the people of Hong Kong, yes, we want you to have democracy, and we want you to have more of it, and we will fight for that. This is before the Basic Law of 1990. And I have no doubt that a large number of people, whether they like to not believe that that's what the British government meant. Simultaneously, the British government was reassuring Beijing that they had no intention of rocking the prevailing apple cart. The central government need have no fear that democracy would be taken forward in the way that a lot of people, as the polls showed here, wanted it to be. So I came away from that experience and wrote about it without great faith in the way in which my government would deal with Beijing. you look now, I happen strongly, personally, to share Chris Patton's view that the UK government historically has been pusillanimous in standing up for the rights of the people of Hong Kong. You only have to see the way in which its criticisms are muted. And there's sound reason from that. There's force majeure, if you like. Trading with Hong Kong, with China, I beg your pardon. Chinese investment in the United Kingdom is regarded as being, I think this is open to question incidentally, dependent upon having a relationship with Beijing which is extremely positive, in which Beijing doesn't come under much assault. Nonetheless, we've heard the British government has reiterated that what was said the other day, that the joint declaration was no longer anything more than history, it didn't have any material use, reiterated the fact that it is an international treaty with two parties to that treaty, signed, lodged with the United Nations, which under the rules of international treaties requires both sides to honour the terms of that treaty and to monitor whether or not the other side is so doing. They pointed that out. That the words that were being expressed, if they did indeed reflect the views of the People's Republic, were in violation of an international treaty. And others would say, if it is a violation, if it were tested, as it were, that would call into question whether you could trust China's word when it came to signing documents. If you are a lawyer, if you are a banker, but between now and 2047, how are you confident that your word written into an agreement is your bond? Now, I am not saying that any of that has come to pass or will come to pass, but those must be the doubts. I think that the British government should be very robust in saying whether or not this agreement has or has not, or will be looking very closely to see whether it has or has not been violated. I think that given what we were talking about before, Brexit, need to have post-Brexit independent trading relations insofar as they can be established with all nations, not least the second largest economy in the world, may overshadow, given our history, may overshadow concern for the evolution of democracy here.
Okay, any questions from the floor? Mr. Dimbleby? From the panel? Okay. Sorry, yes, we have.
I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a sort of British question, but it's an international one. I'm just wondering whether you think that the mood in Britain is now more insular, not really interested in the greater abroad. I wonder if Brexit reflected that. I'm thinking in the past, you used to get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets protesting about Vietnam, a war Britain wasn't involved in, protesting against apartheid, something which, again, Britain wasn't directly involved in. You don't seem to see any of that anymore.
I have to confess I was one of those demonstrators in the past. I think you're right. It's paradoxical, though, because I think quite a lot of people, they don't believe that they are more insular. It's paradoxical because the communication, touching on what I was talking about earlier, the communication with the rest of the world it buzzes more effectively around through social media, all the means of online communication, the terrestrial radio, television channels. We know more about the world at one level, and maybe people seek to retreat from those uncertainties. At the same time, there are those who genuinely believe that we are restricted as a power, as a trading nation, by the fact that we are still inside the European Union, and that once we get outside, there is a brave new world which we can then find ourselves sailing the seas, as it were, once more with a bigger international outlook. And they genuinely believe that. It remains to be seen whether their analysis or feeling sentiment is sound.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
Actually, it kind of follows on from your comments just there, unintentionally. But the Reuters Institute for Journalism Research came out with their digital news report a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things it showed was people are increasingly getting their news as a primary source of news, social media, and trusting it less, and trusting journalism in general less, even though sometimes newspapers are trusted more than social media, sometimes television is trusted more than online media. Generally, trust in media has declined pretty much around the world. I would put forward that this club is dedicated to the pursuing journalism and upholding tradition of journalism as an integral part of the daily communication of our lives. How do we get the trust back? And that's a huge question. I don't expect a complete
It is hugely difficult. I'm sure that analysis doesn't surprise me. I don't know why I use the word surprise. It doesn't surprise me, and I think that's because there is a lot of inaccurate journalism in various places. I think that journalism shrieks too often, and there's an awful lot of it, and people have got to get on with their lives, they're very busy, and you look around. I mean, I can see someone even now. No, I can't see anyone using one. People sit around, even at tables. You don't exist unless you're buzzing, even if you're just saying hello and seeing what the family photograph was. That builds a sense that the world around you is what you see on here, that virtual world. It may be true, it may be false. I don't need to know anything beyond that. I don't want to put in a plug for the BBC, but except to say that the values of the BBC around the world are respected by my peers, and because it is required to be. I'm talking here as a private individual. I'm not an employee of the BBC. I'm a hired hand. I'm a sort of mini candle on a large Christmas tree, and I can easily have a branch taken off. The BBC is, it seems to me, a beacon of what is desirable, and what the BBC is seeking to do, I know, is online and elsewhere to offer what people will gradually see as trustworthy, because what it says is not out with the facts as they then experience them. The problem with so much social media reporting is that you pick up a rumour, you run with it, the lie has got halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And the BBC abjures that. Sometimes it means it's a little bit behind the curve because it wants to get its facts right. And I think in the end, the only way that you do it, whether it's in the written press, whether it's online, is for people like Reuters, who have those values as well, like AP and others, is to keep on at it. Funded so that they can do it, reporting accurately, interpreting honestly, describing what they think is happening, in the hope that gradually people will be, it's very new, the phenomenon of social media, will gradually be more selective in how they interpret it, and will not be misled by people like Donald Trump into believing that the truth is fake.
Jonathan, thank you. Elaine Pickering, I'm a Associate Governor here at the club. I want to reflect back some of the things that you have said. You said that we don't know where we're at right now, but that the central ground is holding.
In Europe.
In Europe. You said what's happening in the world are distractions to what we should be focusing on, which are people's livelihoods, quality of life, etc. So, to coin a phrase, what might be a tipping point by which the stable majority might erupt? And do you think that currently, well, leaders is one thing, but do we have the institutions, do we have the leaders that are going to see us through? And if not, what might see us through all this?
I have to be very careful, because it's so easy to be a grumpy old man, a fogey, and look back to the time of great leaders, not in the distant past, but in the relatively recent past, and to look around now and say, there are not many great leaders. In the United Kingdom, you're hard put to find great leaders, competent politicians. We talked about the United States, you do see one or two great leaders emerging. I actually think Angela Merkel is a great leader. She's had a minority government. All the time she's been in power, she's had no absolute majority, but she has authority because of what she says, how she behaves. She's trusted, even when she makes decisions, like on immigration, that make her for a time extremely unpopular. She says calm, measured. Macron, the emergence of Macron it's very early days, of course, but Macron is not only endorsed powerfully, but has a capacity to see clearly. He's a very remarkable young man, 39 years old. You look to the big powers. You look at Putin's Russia. Putin is powerful, very powerful for a state that is relatively weak. President Xi is powerful because China is a very strong economy and there is a very autocratic system which makes questioning it extremely difficult, as is the case, incidentally, rather more subtly in Russia. And so you look around and wonder whether an awful lot of potential great leaders in the Western world, in Europe, and I can say, do I want to be in this? Isn't there a better way? Because it's such a snarling, uncomfortable, uncertain world. But that's actually where great leaders come through. Churchill came through endless adversity, partly because he was indomitable as a character and he knew he should rule the world, and partly because he stuck at it through thick and thin. And there was a lot of thin time. You know, he was sacked from governments, he was out in the wilderness, he didn't get what he wanted, but he was indomitable. Whether you agree with her or not, Margaret Thatcher was a powerful leader. Tony Blair, he's now broken on the wheel of Iraq, but was a formidable leader, partly because he was the man for his time. He knew how to communicate very effectively. And so, to come back to where I started, I don't know what the tipping point is. If I did, I would either have invested in it or I would have got out of here.
The gentleman, please.
Yes, okay. I'm Angus Forsyth, the solicitor in Hong Kong. Given your respect for the BBC, which I have to say I share, and maybe a lot of us here also do you have a concern for the possible future and immediate and imminent death of Al Jazeera, largely a clone of the BBC, staffed by BBC people, but nonetheless providing a very honest and different attitude of reporting in the Middle East?
I absolutely do. I think the threat to Al Jazeera is deplorable. I am told, and I do not know, and I am suspicious about it, that its Arab service reports in a different way from its English language service. Its English language service is, broadly speaking, in its coverage of international affairs, is impeccably up to the standards of the BBC. In fact, it employs a lot of ex-BBC or post-BBC or pre-BBC people. And I've seen there, and I've met lots of Al Jazeera people over the time. And I have to say, you know, we're going back to reporting. That issue of the crisis in the Gulf, and I've been to Qatar, I've been to Saudi Arabia, I've been to the countries principally concerned, has been covered broadly, I have to say occasionally, even by the BBC, in terms of just reporting what people are saying. And very little. There has been latterly some good analysis on BBC Radio, very little looking closely at what the source of that conflict is. Because the Saudis very skillfully alighted on terrorism as being the issue, and that Qatar was the fount of all terrorism, no one said, well, who is it that the Saudis have supported in the past? What about the Wahhabis? What about what's happening in Yemen? I mean, the idea that there are 6 pure Middle Eastern Gulf states and there's one monstrous state is so lunatic as to defy belief. And Al Jazeera has been very good in being critical about all states. Now, it has been softer on Qatar, there's no doubt. It has been a little softer on Qatar. But if you look at Qatar, it is not clear to me at all that it is any more of an offender. It just happens to have had the wrong alliances from the perspective of some of the Gulf states. So I am very glad you said that, because I think it's a very important broadcasting outlet.
The gentleman here, please. Thank you.
Mike Rouse, 44-year resident of Hong Kong, and I gave back my British passport in 2001. My question concerns Brexit, which baffles me. I mean, I'm not British anymore, but I still have soft feelings for Middlesex Cricket Club and Manchester United, and so it worries me. Do you think after the negotiations, when the British see what Brexit's going to mean, do you think they might reel back in horror and say, what have we done, and change their mind? And part two, how long can Theresa May possibly stagger on without any credibility whatsoever?
I think that the answer to the first question is it depends what Brexit means. If Brexit means effectively falling off a cliff into extreme economic uncertainty, immigration falling because we're in an approaching recession, which would be one of the ironic outcomes, then I think people would be looking again. There are already those who are, and in fact, for quite a long time have said that what matters most to them, even though the immigration issue matters, is economy and jobs. So I think we don't know what's going to be the outturn, which is part of the answer to the second question. Theresa May is fantastically weakened. I mean, for people to be described as Prime Minister all over the place, even by her members of her own party as Maybot, is not exactly a demonstration of authority. And she has very little authority in her party. We see it because of the way in which, and this is just whether I believe that's a good thing or a bad thing is quite another matter. It is true that the cabinet ministers are all some of them making pitches in terms of what should happen to the domestic economy, what kind of Brexit there might be, whether we should stay inside the customs union, whether we should accept the European Court or not. That's all part of a debate which was not happening before, because number 10 was effectively controlled by a very small handful with Theresa May at the apex. She is there, I say she's in office, but it's an old phrase, but not really in power. She's managing until her party decides that she should move on. I don't think any Conservative, any commentator believes that she'll take the United Kingdom to the next election. I could be proved wrong, ma'am. It's when she goes. There's no one at the moment who could comfortably be seen as a front runner to take over. It slightly goes back to what we were talking about, leadership. It's better from the Conservative Party's point of view, even though it's got this quasi-unholy alliance with the DUP, which is the Northern Irish Party, which is unimaginable until now, prefer that to the thought of Jeremy Corbyn being elected in an election which would probably have to follow a change of leadership of the Conservative Party. Moreover, it would further disrupt whatever Brexit outcome we're going to have, because it would postpone yet again the negotiating timetable, increase the degree of uncertainty of what British policy was. So that's why, to go back where we started from, that's why we live in very uncertain times.
Maybe time for one more question from the floor, if this gentleman here.
Joel Lakin for IPPF. Are members involved with investments in India and interaction with high-tech in Israel? You mentioned the consummate politicians. I don't hear you talking about Modi much. He certainly is a factor, right-wing, nationalist. Got along with Trump, didn't he? A little bit. Now goes to Israel for a big hugging match with the Israeli Likud leader. How long is that honeymoon going to last?
I'm not a seer. I noted it, and I don't want to comment because I'm not equipped to comment on Modi in India. I'm aware, obviously, as I am as a general reader of what's happening in India. I have, over the years, followed events in Israel very closely, because it's always intrigued me. One of my early books, in fact, was a book called The Palestinians, which simply, after Golda Meir in 1974 had said there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. I thought that was rather odd, and I should probably find out, and discovered indeed there was such a thing as a Palestinian people. So I followed the whole of the ups and downs of that story. And you have in Israel a very strong very smart, right-wing government which will look for friends wherever it can find them, like most powers, middle-ranking powers will do. And that's really all I can usefully say, without perjuring myself.
So, Jonathan, finally, to give you the opportunity, are there any remarks you would like to make, any issues we haven't touched on, or how would you like to sum up your overall mood as you leave this FCC crowd?
There's only one thing that I'd like to touch on. It's quite important. Before we started, you and I were talking, and we were talking about the relative merits of Hereford cows and Charolais cows, because you come from Ireland, I come from England, and we're both very interested in farming. And I want to say finally, and this is an editorial statement on behalf of myself, that Hereford cows are better than Charolais cows.
I think this is a long conversation you and I would need to have, Jonathan, at a later date. But suffice to say, for now, I just have one final official duty, which is to give Jonathan a small gift from the FCC as a token of our appreciation for giving us your time today. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much, Jonathan.